remember Roncalli's report on Father Matusi's two lectures delivered at the Bergamo Seminary for the purpose of addressing the obvious problem of modernism, the problem that had clearly been diagnosed in that diocese, and because of which he was there, Father Matusi was there in order to try to set things straight. I remember he points out, Father Matusi, the Loisy-type errors in the works of, or in the work, this particular work of Duchene, History of the Early Church. We'll see a little bit more of that. We're not going to have time to study all of these modernists, but we will at least look a little bit at some things that Duchene says in his particular work, the one we're looking at right now. The most offensive one at hand for us here, which was, as we had mentioned yesterday, placed on the index on January 12th, 1912, just 4 months later. So this was highly problematic, enough to get put on the index. Remember that the index is intended for books that are universally condemned. There might be censures placed against various different books, though it might not actually get put on the index if that condemnation is not universally promulgated. It's one of those controversial topics. The Mystical City of God book was, according to what I've read, on the index for a time, but was taken off, not because it was deemed okay, but because the condemnation was not universally promulgated. It was not promulgated in Spain. And perhaps other places as well, but most prominently in Spain. And the idea is that we're not going to, if the condemnation is not universally promulgated, we won't put it on the index. But it's still, at the same time, whenever the kings of Spain would ask for permission for that book to be read everywhere, the answer was no. Whoever it's been forbidden, it's still forbidden. So that's just indicating the extent of disapproval of a book. If it gets put on the index, that is about as bad as it gets. Of course, that being said, just because a book is not on the index doesn't mean that it's fine. Also, a book could be taken off the index if it's amended adequately, if the authors fix whatever problems there are with their books, and then it's assessed that now it's okay to read, now it's safe to read, it might be taken off the index. And it's very strictly forbidden to read any books on the index. In principle, it's a grave sin to disregard the condemnation of the index. There are certain dispensations granted from the prohibition on reading books on the index. So someone doing research, for example, someone who is not likely to be corrupted by the errors, the problems in the book, and is reading it in order to refute it, for example, might be given permission to look at, to read at least some section of it in order to determine the errors and to point out their falsehood. But certain things could be done, but in principle, this means that this book is not something anybody should read. This book should never really have been written, in other words. It would be better if this book did not exist. So that is the extent to which this book was disapproved of by St. Pius X, placed on the index. So we said before that Matusi's allusion to an element of Kantianism in a certain prelate was correctly taken to be a reference to Cardinal Mercier, who tried to make a synthesis of St. Thomas and Immanuel Kant, which is trying to make a square circle. But most offensive of all were Father Matusi's, disparaging remarks about the late Leo XIII and the young men of Christian democracy. So this is interesting. Not only do the modernists clearly not hate Leo XIII the way they hate St. Pius X, but they in fact are offended when anything about Leo XIII is criticized. Leo XIII was absolutely no modernist. Let's not imagine that he was in any way lacking with regard to the faith himself. If you read his encyclicals, they are excellent, which he probably composed himself, in fact. He was a Latinist, an expert in Latin. He could do that, certainly. He had definitely had that level of skill and knowledge of the language to do that, and it's all perfectly orthodox, obviously. There's nothing problematic about any of his teachings, of course, and in fact, it's quite edifying when you read, for example, Satis Cognitum, his encyclical on the Church. It's excellent. But it's one thing to be perfect in the theoretical order, and another to be perfect in the practical order. And Leo XIII, certain policies of his certainly came up short, to say the least. The Cardinal, for example, was in fact a total failure. It did nothing to improve the situation of the Church in Republican France. And so his successor, his immediate successor, then St. Pius X, reversed those policies. And someone who is definitely in the camp, we can say, of St. Pius X, definitely his man, Matusi, is naturally going to be somewhat critical of Leo XIII, saying some of the things the previous pope did were perhaps not the greatest idea. And that can happen. A pope is not guaranteed prudence in his policies in the practical order. That is not part of the charism of infallibility, to be infallibly prudent and to infallibly make always the best decisions. That is not part of it. So imprudent policy on the part of a pope can still cause tremendous damage, in other words, can still cause great problems in some order. So also this, the Roncalli's biographer says, did not go down well in a diocese which had been the most socially committed in Italy. In other words, the most leftist. So criticizing Christian democracy, criticizing Catholics getting involved in political leftism, that's not going to be well received in a diocese which is full of leftists. Remember, Radini Tedeschi had the reputation of being a red bishop, a bishop who was supportive of the workers' strikes in 1909. This is just a couple of years later, so that's fresh in everybody's memories. He's remember even helped fund that, which was denounced, that workers' strike, that whole movement, which was denounced as frankly socialist. You may remember that. We could go back and find the quote. It was a little while ago. It says that the bishop's alms, referring to Radini Tedeschi's contributions, may in fact be first 500 lira, to the workers' strike, brought about quite the reaction in the conservative press. The bishop's alms is a consecration of the strike, a blessing given to a frankly socialist cause. You may remember that. That's one of the earlier pages. Should be what is, let's see. Should be probably page, one of the earlier pages, page 3 or 4. The page numbers were all rearranged. But definitely we saw that. All the leftism in the Diocese of Bergamo. Roncalli concluded his report with the hope that in future, Matusi, misspelled there again, would moderate his tone, not misapply his undoubted gifts, and so contribute to the dear and noble cause, the preservation of Catholic doctrine, in accordance with the mind of Pius X. So, he's saying this is a Roncalli, typical of what he would do. Saying, oh yes, Pius X, he's great. His commitment to preserving the faith is most admirable. But his man on the scene here is a little excessive. But even that might just be the way I don't like his personality. There's just such a, remember I said contrast, repugnanza between his character and mine. Maybe that's the reason why I just cannot enter into his system, is what he said. So that's Roncalli, not blaming, as he sees it, St. Pius X for something that's clearly improper in itself, but instead his man on the scene. Whereas even Roncalli's biographer points out the uncomfortable truth, however, was that Matusi, far from being some maverick lone ranger, in other words, he was no rogue agent here striking out on his own, was much closer to the mind of Pius X than Don Roncalli. In other words, modernism actually is bad, and it was actually heavily entrenched in the Diocese of Bergamo. That's something that needed to be dealt with. St. Pius X realizes it, sends Father Matusi to address it, and he said, and we'll see that shortly here, that he in fact said everything that St. Pius X wanted him to say. And St. Pius X approved of it, certainly after the fact when the whole episode, his lectures and the reaction to them became something much more widespread than simply a local affair. So the Bergamo spies, this is what the biographer calls them, Sodalitium agents, we might refer to them as, began to denounce not Matusi, but the hostile reception he had received. So the Sodalitium keeping tabs on everything here, not only on who the modernists are, where they are, and where we need to go to deal with them, but also how are the remedies received. And in Bergamo, not well, which itself is telling. An anonymous cleric known as LF wrote to the rector of the Bergamo Seminary to say that Matusi's lectures had opened his eyes. They had struck a decisive blow against Duchene, against the 600 members of the Bergamo Priest Association, and against modernist fellow travelers generally. So, not everybody disliked it. There were perhaps some who had swallowed some of this in good faith, but now he is anonymous, but he's just an example of someone who actually he says, now my eyes have been opened, now I actually understand the situation, and I'm grateful for this. And this is a good thing. This really is a problem, and this needs to be dealt with. Now I have understood, he wrote, how right and necessary is intransigence in matters of principle and orthodoxy. But whoever this was a minor character. Again, we don't even actually know what his name was, aside from his initials. Much more serious was Mazzolini's letter to Dolai, so Don Mazzolini, writing to Cardinal Dolai at the consistorial congregation. He wrote as one of the congregations that makes up the Roman Curia. He reported that the president of the Unione had made a vehement protest against Matusi's lectures. Moreover, L'Eco di Bergamo, so it's a publication in the Bergamo diocese, said that Matusi used intemperate language in speaking of Leo XIII and Christian democracy. Leo XIII, remember, was admittedly somewhat liberal in the practical order. Not with regard to the faith, as we've said, but in the practical order. So our man in Bergamo reports that the rector and professors, Roncalli and Bilghini, were using Duchene's History of the Early Church. So the assessment is that the rot was spreading. So this is the kind of thing. We've talked about the Sodalitium Pianum and its program before. Now we see here a concrete example of the kinds of things that they would keep tabs on. What books were being used in the seminary? Who was using them? What was being said? How extensive are the problems in these areas? So this is the kind of thoroughness that they maintained. And you see why now the modernists hated them. It was impossible to avoid their radar, so to speak. So researches in a Bergamo bookshop revealed that 26 priests had ordered copies of Duchene's forthcoming volume in Italian translation. Mazzolini's final thrust was that though Duchene was clearly influential, it will be difficult to arrive at the truth, presumably on the grounds that those attacked would try to do a cover-up. So in other words, we noticed that we looked into even the bookshop to find out how many copies of this book have been ordered, and quite a few, 26. That's a considerable number, or certainly enough to be concerning. There are probably many more priests than that in the diocese, but that's certainly a high enough number to be concerning, especially if those are, say, seminary professors who are ordering them. But it would probably be difficult, he says, to try to figure out who exactly ordered those, for whom those are intended, who wants to read it, because, yes, the hint is that they will try to conceal themselves. This will not be an easy thing to discover. Roncalli's report was dated the next day, September 29th, 1911. So as we said before, the Matusi affair was soon arousing controversy well beyond the Diocese of Bergamo. L'Unità Cattolica of Florence attacked L'Eco di Bergamo, and its editor received a letter of thanks from Bressan, the Pope's secretary. So Bressan also wrote to Matusi himself on October 7th, 1911, "The Holy Father has noted what you said in your kind letter of the 3rd instant." So what that means, that's referring to the date of the current month, 3rd instant, the 3rd of this same month. But even apart from it, His Holiness, his was not capitalized for some reason, but even apart from it, His Holiness was fully informed and completely approves of what you said at the Bergamo Seminary, and is very happy that you should have put your finger on the wound. So all of that Roncalli was reacting negatively to, and that's remember the priest who's a thorn in the side of Cardinal Ferrari has said exactly what St. Pius X wanted him to say, approves, fully informed and completely approves. This is St. Pius X's own secretary certifying this, is very happy that you should have put your finger on the wound, because clearly the Bergamo Seminary is itself a festering wound. That's a problem that needs to be dealt with, a wound that needs to be remedied. No one will dare to ask you for a retraction, not even on the question of whether what you said was opportune or not. This is because the truth has the right to be preached always and everywhere. This applies to Leco's comments on your remarks on democracy. So in other words, that was all in accordance with what St. Pius X himself thought on the matter. So you can be of good heart and rest assured that everyone, when they have had time to think about it, probably when they will have had time to think about it, will be ashamed of this uproar, and it is hoped will learn from it. His Holiness blesses you, etc. So that's quite the, not only far from being any kind of reprimand, that's quite the letter of congratulations and thanks even to Father Matusi for having delivered the exact lectures that he did. And Roncalli's biographer says that Pius X backed this up on December 10th, 1911, with a personal letter to the Archbishop of Florence, Mistrangelo. He was writing to him because L'Unità Cattolica, the Pope's favorite newspaper, was in his diocese. So the periodical attacking the diocesan periodical L'Eco di Bergamo is the bishop of the diocese where that is located gets a personal letter certainly expressing favor because of the fact that that's where that newspaper is located. St. Pius X dismissed L'Eco di Bergamo as a minor paper that was nothing to boast about. This is at least in the words of Roncalli's biographer, and explains that for all the esteem that I have for the clergy of Bergamo, it, meaning that diocese, contains a lot of dead wood, Zamora. And to no other diocese has Duchene's history been so widely diffused and praised. And this is 1 month, this letter is dated, notice here, 1 month and 2 days before the placing of that book on the index. So no book is placed on the index, obviously, unless it has already been noted as problematic. So this is something St. Pius X has likely already made up his mind to condemn it. It's just a matter of publishing that. And that is precisely what he does just a number of weeks later. In the court of Pius X, writes Roncalli's biographer acrimoniously, this vision of history, meaning Roncalli's, was not yet fashionable, nor even understood. So it's just because they were behind the times and a bit backwards that this better developed and more advanced understanding of things has not been received. That's the reason for this. And now Father Ricosta says, going back to his take on all this, certainly it wasn't Roncalli's preference for Baronius that displeased St. Pius X, but for Duchene. That's true. Baronius was, it's actually, let's say here in a sense, Duchene was good at putting facts together, but he was not good at, presenting them correctly. That his works sinned in other ways, of course, by omission, and seriously. But he was still, materially, a historian of importance. So he was somebody very prominent in that field, but most definitely not of the caliber, certainly not of Cardinal Baronius, whose ecclesiastical annals are nothing short of monumental. And because he, most importantly, actually had the Catholic faith. whereas Duchene, it's questionable at best. So Monsignor Louis Duchene was, as we said before, undoubtedly, materially, an historian of importance. Monsignor Benigni, himself also an historian and the founder of Sodalitium Pianum, whom one could not suspect of sympathy for modernism, recognized him as such. So he was a great historian in a material sense, but only in a material sense. By contrast, he was not a great Catholic historian. He lacked the essence of a true historian, a supernatural and a Christian view of history united to a spirit of respect for tradition as well as for ecclesiastical traditions. The academic ecclesiastical career of Duchene went forward at full sail until the publication of his book, History of the Early Church, which ended up being put on the index. Yes, that definitely will put the brakes on someone's ecclesiastical career to have something he wrote put on the index. Most definitely. There are some cases, actually, of all of the works of a particular author being put on the index. There are some cases of that, or at least all of the books of this particular type that fall under this heading by this author being put on the index. So, this was put on the index, which probably is a euphemism to say slowed down his career somewhat. The Duchene affair, following his History of the Early Church, was due to the initiative of Cardinal Billot. It was this whole event was launched in August 1910 by a long campaign of Unità Cattolica in Florence upon the initiative of St. Pius X himself. Monsignor Maccarone confirms these facts and imputes to Cardinal Billot the principal role of denunciator. So Cardinal Billot was around and active at this time. He wrote his De Ecclesia, that was already been published, as we saw, by this time, which is an excellent work. Cardinal Billot was definitely made. There's some prominent instances of his being in error on certain points, but on the whole, he's very good, Cardinal Billot. And his De Ecclesia is especially interesting. He was an example, actually, of a cardinal who was never a bishop. There were it was only John XXIII, actually, Roncalli, who's laid down the rule that all cardinals must be bishops. Before then, that was definitely not the case. And Cardinal Billot was an example of that. So at a certain point, he actually resigned the cardinalate. That was during the reign of Pius XI. He resigned the cardinalate and went back to being just a Jesuit priest. But this time, he was made a cardinal by St. Pius X, from whom he accepted it reluctantly, but was definitely no modernist. Whatever errors he may have made, there were nothing along the lines of modernism, that's for sure. So the unmasking of Duchene is traced then to a saint, Pius X, and to a great theologian, Cardinal Billot, who inspired the condemnations conveyed by Cardinal Billot. Another story, it's a story, I haven't read it anywhere, but another story about Cardinal Billot, who was, as we said, a Jesuit, being required, because of that, to use Molina in some course he was teaching. Read from the book in class, and the story is, closed the book then and threw it at the wall and said, Verba Diaboli, words of the devil. In other words, that the errors that Molina's errors are so serious that we can call them the words of the devil. So definitely you'll see that when you study it, the Molinism is in fact wrong, and St. Thomas and the Thomists are correct in explaining the workings of grace and predestination. Nor were all Jesuits of the Molinist school. But it is an interesting tendency that you'll see among theologians that it's for one thing, I can't think of any exceptions to this, that they're members of religious orders. If religious orders had a higher level of training than the diocesan clergy had, typically. The diocesan clergy are traditionally known to be somewhat, at least of a lesser intellectual caliber than members of religious orders. So it was widely known that especially the Dominicans and the Jesuits had the best training. The Dominicans, in fact, had 3 years of philosophy. That's why we have the 3-volume work of Hugon, upon whom we base our philosophy courses. That's in 3 volumes meant for a 3-year. Each one of those volumes was covered in 1 year of philosophy in Dominican houses of studies in their seminaries. So the Dominican training was very thorough. The Jesuit training was also known to be also quite thorough. Of course, they had their problems in their we'll say their speculative theology. They were still known. Their training had the reputation of being quite rigorous. Their intellectual formation, and not all of them were Molinists, as you've seen, but there's a tendency, you notice, among theologians to follow the schools of theologians, whether canonized or not, of their own orders, which is why, say, for example, Franciscans tend to be Scotists. And you see, Scotus was one of those characters. His name comes up in connection with just about all of the wrong opinions, almost always. The one thing he famously got right was his explanation of the Immaculate Conception, and that was out of at least in opposition to what was perceived as the position of St. Thomas. So he was Scotus is almost always wrong. Almost. The one thing that really saved his reputation is, again, Immaculate Conception. But because he was a Franciscan, Franciscans tend to be Scotists. And Jesuits tend to follow Suarez or Molina. Not all of them. It's not as though every time you see S.J. on a theological work that it's bound to be wrong or anything like that. But there is a high chance of it. There certainly is a high chance of it. Whereas Dominicans, I've never heard of at least not before times of modernism, no Dominican who was not a Thomist. Yes, St. Thomas was a Dominican. Say the Carmelites were known also for being Thomists. In fact, there's one work it's a well-known theology manual, the dogmatic theology work by Zubizarreta, who was a Carmelite. That's very good. He's very Thomistic. And in fact, there's a whole section defending St. Thomas from the accusations from the assertions that St. Thomas didn't actually hold the Immaculate Conception, because there are some quotations from St. Thomas which certainly at first glance make it appear that he did not. There's a bit of a controversy about that. What did St. Thomas actually think? Of course, at the time, in any case, it was an open question. There was legitimately debated. Whereas there was many centuries, of course, before the definition of the Immaculate Conception in 1854 by Pius IX. But you can make a convincing case that St. Thomas actually did agree with it. But that's a whole nother story, which really, and it's an interesting thing in itself to see what St. Thomas said about it. But ultimately, we have the definition of the Church on that, and we know what to hold concerning the Immaculate Conception, and that is obviously the most important thing. And the point is that Zubizarreta, a Carmelite, was himself so much a Thomist that he embarks upon defending St. Thomas from the notion that St. Thomas did not hold, that St. Thomas may have been wrong at least at one time on that. But that's a whole other story. So, Cardinal Billot, Jesuit, truly a great theologian, and we have his De Ecclesia in the library here. It's definitely an excellent work. It is said that the unmasking of Duchene traced back to St. Pius X and Cardinal Billot, who inspired the condemnations conveyed by Cardinal Delay. So the Italian edition was published, had just been published in 1911. There we go. Should be 1911, not 19N. That's optical character reader work for you. The Italian edition had just been published in 1911, translated by the modernists Buonaiuti and Turchi, and was immediately forbidden in the Italian seminaries by a circular of Cardinal Delay dated September 1st, 1911. So, remember Buonaiuti, later on excommunicated by Benedict XV for denying the real presence. He it is who was one of the translators of this into Italian, from the original French into the Italian, of this work of Duchene, which was, after this circular went out, just a few months later, circular of Cardinal Delay forbidding it in seminaries, just a few months later, it's in fact put on the index. the reading of it, the reading of this history of the early church by Duchene, was judged to be extremely dangerous and even mortal, so gravely sinful, because of its calculated and continual silences, particularly in that which concerned the supernatural, be it the manner in which the author speaks of the martyrs, fathers of the church, or the dogmatic controversies. And this is from the Acta Apostolicae Sedis. So the Acta Apostolicae Sedis is the official organ of the Holy See. If something is published in the Acta Apostolicae Sedis, it is an official pronouncement of the Holy See. So you can find all the encyclicals, for example, those are all published in the Acta Apostolicae Sedis. It is so if I find this document in it, this letter forbidding the reading of Duchene in the Acta, that's already very serious, obviously. Even before that's put on the index, it's still very serious. So there's a great many different things that are published in the Acta. You can find even documents in all different languages, actually. Mostly Latin, but there are all different languages, even some things in English. Say, for example, some addresses that Pius XII gave in English. You can find those in the Acta, published in the language in which it was given in English. And I can think of one in particular. But in any case, in October 1911, Mary Dorval congratulated the director of Civiltà Cattolica in the name of Pius X for the critique he had done of this work. So everything about this work is getting condemned. Everybody who's critical of it is getting approved of. And on January 22nd, 1912, referring back to December 11th, 1911, it was January 22nd, unless the dates are somehow, typos have gotten into the dates here, but it was January 22nd, rather than the 12th, on which it was condemned and placed on the index. The 3 published volumes were listed in the catalog of the index without distinction of edition. So sometimes that can happen to a particular edition of a work be condemned, and then the author fixes it up, and then the subsequent editions are not condemned. That can happen too. So, for example, that came up with regard to the XII Française, that the way in which that was condemned. There are some questions on that. Maybe it's possible, in other words, for the Holy See to condemn certain issues. I'm not saying that was necessarily the case with regard to the XII Française, but that's something that could have been done, for example, is condemning certain issues of them, which, as I recall, was done, but that's for another period. Duchene submitted in the manner of Bonomelli and so many others in words only. So in reality, as much before as after the condemnations of 1911 and 1912, the private and hidden Duchene was much worse than the official Duchene. In other words, he's externally submitted, just as Roncalli did, but privately clearly not changed his ideas at all. So already in 1889, when he was director of the French school at Rome, in a letter of March 2nd addressed to the modernist deceiver, Baron von Hugel, Duchene compared the Catholic Church to Dante's Inferno, at the entrance of which is written, "Abandon all hope, you who enter here." So it's a reference to Dante's Divine Comedy, as it's called, somebody going through a journey through hell and purgatory and then heaven. And it's a commentary, depending on whom he places where, it's a commentary on all kinds of different things. And yes, the Inferno is the section, as the name suggests, in which the traveler in question journeys through hell. And so that is written at the top of it. So he says he's comparing that he's applying that to the Catholic Church. Just imagine the impiety of that. This is during the reign of Leo XIII that he says that, a reign with which modernists had much less problem than that of St. Pius X. In fact, it was really during the reign of Leo XIII that it was all really coming together. So Dante was of the anti-papal faction in Italy at his time, and so perhaps there's some parallel there, but further examination of that is not really our focus here. So if such were his feelings, this is Father Vercosa, if such were his feelings before the condemnation of 1911, imagine what were those following it. Pula, that's an author quoted by Father Vercosa, who's not Roncalli's authoritative biographer, definitive biographer, we should say, but simply just another author. He quotes, gives us an illustration with excerpts from some of Duchene's letters. You can't imagine how heads are worked up. Ignis ardens, so the burning fire, in reference to Pius X, is unchained. The most insane hypotheses are authorized by St. Pius X. The fanatics triumph and become more and more inflamed. God knows how it will end. Perhaps with another pope, but when? Remember, the idea of placing some revolutionary into the papacy was not a new one. That was Fogazzaro writing the word Il Santo, imagining effectively a modernist pope, whose name was Benedict. Whether it was with that in mind that Giacomo della Chiesa took the name Benedict XV is perhaps a stretch to say, but you can't help but wonder. And this is, again, this actually echoes things that Cardinal Newman said, that just hang tight effectively, another pope will trim the ship. A later pope, perhaps a later council, he may have even mentioned, will trim the ship. That's Cardinal Newman, and now also seeing here Duchene. He says, the Pope is so, again, reference to Pius X, obviously, there's no one else he would have been referring to. The Pope is so crafty, so accustomed to supporting people in security until he trips them up. The case certainly has been pathological for a long time. If it continues, it will finally be apparent. In other words, it will eventually be clear to everybody just how crazy he is. It's not natural that the church should be indefinitely sabotaged by its head. Yeah, words that, in light of St. Pius X's later canonization, obviously, would not age so well. And you can see why the modernists were so devastated, really, at the canonization of St. Pius X, which was done by Pius XII. You can see why, because they really hated everything about him. The Italian clergy and the Curia itself have more and more the air of believing that they are in the presence of an unexpected event, an invasion of the Vatican by a troop of irregulars. Now, certainly it was, in the grand scheme of things, considering the popes who came immediately after, there was obviously a very great contrast between the reign of St. Pius X and those following. The reign of St. Pius X was really can be looked upon as the last Zelante reign, so to speak. Really the last one. Benedict XV was definitely not, and Pius XI didn't quite swing back all the way. Not quite. And we saw the extensive influence of Cardinal Pacelli during that reign. Whatever Pius XI's natural inclinations, it didn't swing back all the way. And then Pius XII, Cardinal Pacelli, once he became Pope, well, that was it as far as accommodationism. That, in other words, that won over completely. There was no more question as to which was the dominant policy for nearly 20 years. And then after that, Roncalli. So the 29-year-old Roncalli, at this point, professor of ecclesiastical history, fell in on the side of Duchene. We'll see this. And this even after the first condemnation on September 1st, 1911. While the book was banned in Italian seminaries, Roncalli had his students use it. Here are the dates taken from the definitive biography. On September 1st, 1911, Duchene's work is prohibited in the Italian seminaries. Throughout autumn 1911, 2 conferences of Father Matusi at the Bergamo Seminary, in which the Reverend Father attacks Duchene, and then, as we saw, the Bishop of Bergamo, Radini Tedeschi, demands a private report from Don Roncalli on Father Matusi's conferences. Then, also in September 1911, an unsigned article by Roncalli in La Vita Diocesana on Duchene and another article in L'Eco di Bergamo against Matusi. September 28, 1911, Don Mazzolini writes to Cardinal Delay, should be capitalized probably, Delay, that Roncalli was using Duchene's The History of the Early Church. On September 29, 1911, Roncalli's private report to his bishop, to Berdini Tedeschi, already cited, is sent, in which Matusi is attacked and Duchene defended. Then on October 7th and December 10th, St. Pius X takes Matusi's part against L'Eco di Bergamo, or against Don Roncalli, who wrote in it, and Duchene. So October 7th, remember the letter from Bressan to Matusi, and then on December 10th, St. Pius X's own personal letter to Matusi, approving of everything he said and did. So Cardinal Delay took advantage of a visit to Rome on June 1st, 1914, by Don Roncalli, in the company of the seminary's rector and bursar, to verbally invite Roncalli to exercise prudence in his teaching. He was known to be using Duchene. On June 2nd, Roncalli, stunned, supposedly, wrote to the cardinal protesting his fidelity. The official biography has it, on June 12th, 1914, Delay answered, apparently in a friendly fashion, "I'm sorry you were so disturbed by my advice to you. It was not a reproach, but a salutary warning." But then he, Cardinal Delay, revealed the real cause of his displeasure. "According to information that has come my way, I know that you had been a reader of Duchene and other unbridled authors, and that on certain occasions you had shown yourself inclined to that school of thought which tends to empty out the value of tradition and the authority of the past, a dangerous current which leads to fatal consequences, etc. So, we're warning you, don't use Duchene. That's very dangerous. So Don Roncalli did not find it very easy to reply. That would be a difficult thing to reply to. His letter went through several drafts and had many corrections, all of which he preserved. By June 27th, he was ready to post it, so ready to send it in the mail to Cardinal Delay. "I do not believe that the information comes from anyone who knows me," he began. He was prepared to deny all the charges on oath. In particular, "I have never read more than 15 to 20 pages, and even then just as a sampler, of Volume 1 of the Histoire Ancienne de l'Église," the second edition, Paris, 1906, even specifies that. "I've never even seen the other two volumes. I have therefore not read a single line of Duchene's history translated by Turki, and never had them in my hands or among my books. I knew the French prelate, meaning Duchene, a little, but I never had any sympathy with him, even when he made corrections intended to put to rest doubts about his orthodoxy. I was fairly familiar with the ideas of Turki, who for some months was a fellow student at the Roman Seminary, but he never confided in me. I remember more than once expressing my feelings of mistrust and antipathy towards him to my fellow seminarians." And this is Father Ricosa commenting on this. "What can we think of Roncalli?" That should be think, obviously. "What can we think of Roncalli's affirmations with oath when his very own hagiographer," in quotes, a hagiographer meaning someone who writes the life of someone holy. So Father Ricosa is somewhat sarcastically referring to the author of Roncalli's biography as a hagiographer, someone who is writing what is not the life of a saint, clearly, but who seems to think he is. When his very own hagiographer writes, "There is only one word to describe Roncalli's letter to Delay: groveling." So his own admirer has to admit, yes, this is definitely a groveling letter he's writing. In his anxiety to please his inquisitor, he has forgotten the note on Duchene that appeared in La Vita Diocesana in September 1911. It was unsigned, but he, Roncalli, admitted authorship. In it, he said that he did not want to take sides in the controversy about Duchene and confined himself to reading and studying. But now that his back is to the wall, Roncalli obliterates these memories. And Father Rocosa comments on that. Or, simply speaking, is talking nonsense. So there is no way, in other words, that that's true, that he actually just forgot about that. He just said that he's just lying, ultimately, speaking nonsense to save his own skin.